Other data collection instruments that were being used for the study included an independent book choice exit survey that was used at the end of the third marking period. The students used this document to kind of fill out information about how they felt about choosing their own books and doing their own independent study. This is a qualitative collection instrument that was used. So a lot of the information that's in here was based off of nominal data and open-ended questions. I used grounded theory and axial coding to determine the correlation between the student interest and the student performance. So looking at some of the qualitative instruments that I used, quantitative data instruments that were used, looking at their grades and kind of comparing them to some of the coding that I found using grounded theory kind of corroborated how student interest and student performance go in hand in hand. Quantitative data used to corroborate adjustments were made in the curriculum implementation, meaning I was able to do it in real time using feedback from both the kids and their nominal data and objective feedback, as well as their scores to kind of determine the success or failure of how the curriculum was being rolled out. Survey takes student choice and social emotional learning consideration for the curriculum choices. And if we click on the document real quick, we can kind of do a little overview to kind of see what the assessments kind of entailed here. This particular instrument, like I said, was some nominal data, basically giving students an opportunity to discuss things like pacing, rigor, mental health, assessments that they enjoyed, the type of writing assignments they had, accessibility to the work, the types of topics and feedback. So there's a lot of different qualitative data that was gathered for the students for this particular instrument. Blanket Test 3 Form C. This was done at the end of the year. Like the other units, this is aligned to the NJCCSS, both for reading literature and informational text. The assessment, again, is set up like the first two assessments, except this one, rather than being a baseline assessment or a benchmark assessment, you use as a culminating assessment to determine student reading fluency. This is administered at the end of the school year, at the end of marking period 4, to use as a document to kind of check to see if the students in the different proficiency groups are hitting their learning targets. The quantitative data that was used for this particular study, again, like the other units in the study, kind of helped inform some of the adjustments that were made for the curriculum and the curriculum implementation. The end of year student end of year exit survey that was given to the students was a very comprehensive overview of the school year. It featured tons of qualitative data about student learning experiences and the adjustments that were made to the curriculum implementation throughout the year. There were a lot of Likert scales and open-ended questions for students to determine the effectiveness of not only the curriculum but of their teacher as well. It offered an opportunity to get some feedback about the strengths and weaknesses that were implemented in the curriculum, improvements that the students feel were needed, as well as recommendations that they would make about how the curriculum was structured. A lot of this information obviously was used to inform the curriculum evaluation that was conducted for this capstone study. Excuse me. Curriculum evaluation product that was determined for this, as I mentioned before, was based off of a rubric that was created by the state of New Jersey. The rubric that I used here was as a means to kind of get a sense of how the curriculum was framed and looking at the different curricular components that were being determined. You can see on the left-hand side here all the different curricular components being outlined, and then the middle part here, a Likert scale determining the effectiveness of each of those different components, whether they're exceeding, meeting, approaching, partially meeting, or not meeting proficiency standards for the way the curriculum should be designed. The curriculum tool also provides an opportunity to jot down some notes and observations about the curriculum in its current state, and then recommendations that would be used based off of analyzing the curriculum in isolation, as well as using the data provided by the students in the surveys and qualitative instruments. You can see some of the components here, like for example, shifts in instruction and learning, ensuring that the quality of the pedagogical practices in the curriculum are consistent with modern approaches to teaching curricula. And certainly there's some subcomponents there listed A through D. And again, each one of these components were kind of scaled on these Likert scales, and determinations about the curriculum are being made in the evaluation. In addition to shifts in education and instruction and learning, curriculum framework was part of what we were looking at. Unit organization and purpose and the subcomponents involved with that. The end of unit and standardized assessment to make sure that there was alignment between the formative assessments that were being created for the unit as well as summatives. Looking at the special needs populations in the study, that includes students with learning disabilities and ELL, the English language learners. Instructional resources that were being used to implement the lessons, and that includes, different aspects of the diversity, complexity, rigor, accessibility to different learning populations, evidence-based materials, etc. Text complexity, looking at the rigor and ensuring that students had ample opportunity to engage in complex text. Diversity, looking at unique cultural experiences and perspectives as opposed to looking at things through a singular solitary lens. Research, writing, and technology, being able to assess the instructional technology as well as ensuring that students have access to technology during research writing. Using and utilizing speaking and listening standards, which are often neglected. And also, number 11, language development, looking at the elements that go into effective pieces of language. And that includes vocabulary acquisition, both in context and outside of context, as well as learning conventions of grammar. Research methodology for this research study is a mixed methods approach. Certainly, there's aspects of quantitative data, and the proficiency scores and growth are being determined using the data from the Linkit assessments in particular. In terms of quantitative data, some numbers to kind of work with, percentiles, things like that. They had 3 standardized assessments in Linkit altogether, and then obviously they had several assessments throughout the year that were standards aligned that were recorded in the researcher's gradebook during the 20 and 21 school year. In terms of qualitative data that was being used as part of the mixed methods approach here, as I mentioned before, there were lots of surveys and instruments that were used and involved Likert scales and other nominal data to kind of support the learning experience that students were having. There were several survey instruments that were used during the 2021 school year that have been archived, that were accessed and applied to the study, and they were used to kind of corroborate the quantitative findings, as well as inform a lot of the curricular revision and recommendations that were made as part of this curriculum evaluation. The data in this case, both quantitative and qualitative data, was used in tandem to kind of combat any flaws or inconsistencies that may misinterpret the results of the data. Data collection was administered from the district archive data from the 2021 school year with permission from the district superintendent. As I mentioned before, the quantitative data was stored in the Linkit database. Linkit is the storage database for all the quantitative data for the school district. And the qualitative data was stored in Google Forms in my personal Google account that was attached to the district webpage. So I needed permission from the superintendent to be able to access the archive data from both those qualitative and quantitative resources. The data was analyzed over the course of several days using several different data analysis techniques in order to kind of get a sense of how they would help and enhance the data collection for the evaluation that was conducted for this curriculum. Data collection continued. The curriculum was first assessed in isolation using the evaluation tool derived from the NJCCSS evaluation tool that I showed you before. The archive data from the 2021 school year was later applied to a second evaluation to corroborate the initial findings and draw conclusions about the designations or recommendations that were found both in the qualitative data from the student surveys and instruments, as well as the researchers and observations. Data analysis methods that were employed during this research study. Number 1, descriptive statistics obviously was used in order to make the data a little bit more easily understood. There's a lot of very idiosyncratic language that's used in language arts, as well as in some of the data. So being able to use descriptive statistics to make some sense of that data is important. There's some Likert scales that were used, obviously, to determine the degree to which things are being satisfied. And then certainly district-specific and subject-specific terminology, as I mentioned before, need to be described and clarified for anybody reading the study. Inferential statistics was likewise used. The inferential statistics were used to kind of explain the correlation that exists between the data sets. And being that there were many instruments that were used for the study, there was a lot of data to kind of connect the dots with. And inferential statistics went a long way to kind of making that a little bit more clear. In some ways, using quantitative data to inform qualitative, and other ways using qualitative data to kind of form the quantitative, which I'll kind of go over a little bit later in some of the results of the study. Using and analyzing probabilities and likelihoods of correlated data wouldn't be possible without inferential statistics, so it was an essential part of data analysis. I also used grounded theory by Corbin and Strauss. Grounded theory has several steps to it. It's kind of a scaffolded process that first starts off with open coding, and that's to kind of break up the quantitative and qualitative data into more discrete parts and categories, particularly categories that are more aligned with the evaluation tool that was being used, so that a lot of the data that I was finding had some sort of application to the evaluation tool. Once open coding was established, axial coding is the next step in grounded theory. And axial coding is basically what makes you allows you to make connections between the codes that were outlined in the previous step. So kind of being able to look at things a little bit more closely, see if there's any data that's overlapping by evaluating statistics, seeing if there's any correlations or anything that are kind of being established by looking at the different types of data through the coding. And this kind of helps explain and inform some of the connections established during descriptive and inferential statistics. By using axial coding, it's kind of like an extra layer of data analysis that kind of corroborates to make sure the data and connections that I'm making in the study are supported. Last step is selective coding. And this is where the last step that allows you to draw conclusions from that overlapping corroborating data, like I said. Certainly being used to identify root causes in poor performance and in relation to curriculum, and being able to figure out the critical steps that are necessary in order to make the curriculum more accessible, and more importantly, to improve student proficiency on, assessments that were aligned to both reading informational text and literature. Another data analysis technique that was used is thematic analysis. Certainly, there were 5 different surveys that were used during the course of the study, so there's a lot of thematic analysis that needs to be done, looking at things like learning preferences, learning experiences, different forms of assessments, and kind of, putting those things into different categories in order to ascertain the data a little bit more clearly. Like the other data analysis techniques, it was used to establish patterns and correlations that exist using thematic data and in descriptive and inferential statistics. So you can kind of see how the different data analysis techniques overlap with each other in order to kind of corroborate and make the best determinations about the curriculum evaluation. It's kind of a cohesive technique, like it says here, to help corroborate the statistics from the other data analysis methods, rather than just study these statistics in isolation. Uses key terms in universal language to help qualify the data. So, using themes and all-encompassing words and umbrellas kind of give you a place to kind of place the data so that the data isn't just kind of all over the place. It actually has some themes that are used kind of like coding in a sense. This kind of helps identify new insights and concepts in the data when blending the methods of data analysis. So sometimes using a method like thematic analysis kind of brings things out that you wouldn't see using some of the other data analysis techniques in isolation. The last data analysis technique that I use is concurrent triangulation design, which is CTD. This was done by Cresswell. This uses both qualitative and quantitative data collection methods in tandem with one another. And for example, a teacher can implement the curriculum in marking period 1. Like I said before, it was the established curriculum in which no real modifications are being made. Looking at the quantitative data, I can use formative assessment grades and performance, as well as their assessments, their baseline from Form A, their assessment, and then using qualitative data, the survey results about the student's opinion on formative assessment, in tandem with one another to make determinations about how to make changes or amendments to the curriculum. This method is used to confirm, cross-validate, and corroborate findings, like some of the other study data analysis techniques I mentioned before. CTD can be used to inform curriculum evaluation and possible adjustments made based on a combination of quantitative and qualitative feedback. And more importantly, like it says here, adjustments can be made in real time rather than waiting until the end of the conclusion of a unit. Students are obviously demonstrating a downward trend or poor proficiency on their scores in the mid part of the unit, and then there is survey data to kind of support why that's happening. It becomes an important way to kind of, for the researcher, rather than wait till the end, to modify the curriculum midstream to give the kids an opportunity to demonstrate better proficiency, especially when the summative assessment at the end of the unit is coming up. Looking at some graphic representation in data tables based off the results and some of the instruments that were being used. The first box over here, how often do you enjoy reading tasks that your teacher assigns? And looking at the data here, you can see that the teacher-centeredness in the curriculum affects student choice and dispositions toward learning. In terms of how often they enjoy the reading task, only 25% of the kids enjoy the task fairly often, whereas the other 75% of the students kind of fall in the sometimes, once in a while, or almost never category. Kind of shows some of that indifference that we were talking about before, and that lack of student motivation that kind of contributes to some of those negative scores. Another question that was asked: if you feel like my English teachers take student interest into consideration when designing the curriculum. Only 25% of students feel their teachers take their interest in consideration with choices in the curriculum. And obviously, when we talked about the teacher-centeredness of the curriculum before, if only 25% of the students feel like the teachers are taking their interests at heart, 100% of the curriculum is only going to interest 25% of the students, which is a very poor and low ratio. So finding ways to kind of modify the curriculum in a way to encapsulate or include students, or at least feel like their interests are being taken into consideration, will go a long way to improving student proficiency. I feel like my English teachers use the most effective strategies to engage 21st century learning. As you can see in this handout, or in this data set here, data table here, very similar to the table before it. Only 25% of the students feel like the teacher is using effective strategies for 21st century learning. Certainly, being in virtual learning, virtual cohorts during the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated that. But I think the most troubling statistic here is the level of indifference here. How many students chose a neutral designation about whether or not they feel confident about their teachers getting them ready for 21st century skills. So definitely something that's eye-opening and data that will be used to kind of inform that curriculum revision. I'm likely to complete an assignment that is hard if I chose the assignment for myself. This data table I thought was interesting because it shows that 33% of students are willing to work through difficult tasks and assignments if they got to choose their own form of assessment, suggesting that if students have a hand in selecting their own form of assessment, they're twice as likely to work through them if they're difficult tasks, based on being more interested in the content or task. This data is interesting because it kind of shows that, rather than give up on an assessment or not want to complete an assessment because it's difficult, if it's something the student chose for themselves, 33% of the students are either agree or strongly agree that they're willing to work through a task anyway, whereas only 17% of students would come out and say that they wouldn't move through it. Certainly, half the students are neutral about it, but I think it's interesting to see that more than twice the number of kids are willing to work through something difficult if they chose it for themselves. That speaks volumes about student centeredness. It says a lot about student choice as well. In this chart here, the curriculum was kind of modified throughout the course of the year to include more student choice and more forms of assessment of students choosing, and culminated in the fourth marking period when students got to design their own curriculum plan, meaning they got to choose their own reading selections that they wanted to read, more informative assessments to demonstrate proficiency. You can see the sharp growth over the course of the year for the students. There is one downward trend between the second and third marking periods here, but like it's noted down here in the bottom, marking period 3 featured dramatic increases in case of COVID-19, which forced the students back into a 100% virtual or distance learning for about 4 weeks. And certainly with the kids kind of reverting back to distance learning, interest and motivation kind of waned a little bit. So the averages kind of dropped in the third marking period. But once the students were allowed to return to school and then given full autonomy to design their own curriculum, you can see a very sharp jump in student performance on reading literature and reading informational text. Did you like being able to choose your own book for this past unit? And again, this had to do with student-centeredness and students selecting their own resources. You can see that students overwhelmingly enjoy what they were reading because of their previous investment in reading selections. The performance on the previous slide indicates a positive correlation of student proficiency as a result of the same investment. So, if we go back a slide, you can see when students are invested in their own reading, their own choices, their own assessments, they perform very, very well. And certainly, their nominal data here supports that notion that 81% of students that said it was, made them want to read more because they got to choose what they wanted to read. And only 9.5% of students didn't really like the unit at all. So very overwhelming. Mental health obviously was a big concern during the COVID-19 crisis, with students kind of being back and forth to school, with the vacillating nature of um, being in school, being out of school, learning synchronously, learning asynchronously, being able to evaluate their mental health. This particular data shows that 81% of students report a positive experience in navigating their own learning, choosing their own reading and writing assignments. Most of the students felt some degree of stress. However, the variables for the other stressors were not measured. So, um, looking at the data here, 81% of students kind of gave positive results that despite the fact that the learning environment was being compromised or being mitigated or changed in some way, that 81% of students still had a positive experience when they got to choose their own works, showing that they were able to kind of maintain good mental health overall in a situation that really in some ways was out of their control. This data shows that students had some flexibility in terms of which assignments they wanted to complete and having a week to complete it. And as you can see, 90% of the students here enjoyed having a flexible timeline to complete their assessments of their own choosing. This positive correlation of proficiency and performance in a previous slide corroborates the finding. So basically, when students had an opportunity to, work on something a little bit more, they were able to do better on the assignment rather than feeling pressed for time or having concern about getting something done that was teacher-centered as opposed to student-elected. Looking at proficiency scores for reading, literature, and informational text here, this kind of breaks down the median and the average scores. The proficiency scores for reading, literature, and informational text showed a positive correlation with only a slight dip in the third marking period due to the district reverting back to virtual distance learning for 4 weeks, like I mentioned before. The proficiency median scores demonstrated consistent growth throughout, with nested results for special needs populations likewise demonstrating adequate growth and progression on par with more proficient counterparts. So, in looking at the blue average here, we kind of see it dip down slightly. There were some outlier students who performed exceptionally poorly in the third marking period, which pulled down the overall average. But looking at the median score, you can see the median score kind of produced more consistent results, and the special education and nested population follows the same trajectory as the median scores here, which shows growth both with the regular level students as well as the special education population. Independent reading units, how they should be structured. Like it says here, although the current curriculum is 100% teacher-centered, only 5% of students feel it should stay that way. Most students believe there should be a mix of student choice and teacher choice, and 30% of students think that it should be all student choice. So obviously, the students having a hand in their own curriculum design and their own book choices and assessments goes a long way in terms of improving their investment in learning and the proficiency that results in their assessments. How many independent reading units do you think we should do next year? 90% of students feel there should be at least 2 units that feature independent reading. The curriculum, the way it's currently constructed, doesn't have really room for much independent reading at all. But with some of the piloting that we did in the 2021 school year, giving students an opportunity to read independently and choose books of their own liking and their own choosing, due to the inaccessibility to resources in the book room, gave them the opportunity to kind of explore things in a way that brought about some positive results and positive feelings about being able to choose independent books. These two graphs in this page here, being able to choose your own book study, we had talked about a little bit before. Most students found it refreshing, and other students found it to be somewhat different, but they enjoyed it. Basically, showing that 100% of students kind of gave favorable feedback about being able to choose their own book. Likewise, the scores down here, we looked at this chart a little while ago. It says that although reading proficiency average is down unit 3, it should be noted that median proficiency average stayed consistent. We talked about that before. So certainly there's a strong correlation that exists here between student choice and how much they enjoyed their own choices and the positive growth that they had as a result of that. The last slide here, this is about building their own curriculum plan. And in the fourth marking period, students had to choose not only the books that they wanted to read, but the types of assessments they wanted to complete that kind of go along with their own study. And as you can see, there was 100% favorable results from the students based off of the building their own curriculum. Like it says here, they got to choose not only their own books, but to build a curriculum plan, choosing their own assessments. They're all aligned to New Jersey core content state standards. Students provided prodigiously positive feedback. Only 30% of students reported some confusion during the process, but obviously that's to be expected when there's so many different learning situations going on at the same time. Most students provided some positive feedback about being able to design their own learning. Variety and diversity obviously played a role in curriculum design as well. When they got to build their own curriculum plan in marking period 4, they had a lot more different choices in terms of books to choose from, as well as unique learning styles and assessments. And like it says here, and students got to choose not only their own books to study, but their own curriculum. Students were given a variety of texts to choose from, including perspectives from women and people of color. Students were also offered a unique and diverse types of assessment that was addressed during their learning needs that was based on the data that I've received throughout the school year. So, some of that data analysis that was being done at the time kind of informed some of the changes that were made in the curriculum by the fourth marking period. And as you can see, the 50% of the students believed that it was a good mix of diversity and assessments that were being offered. Only 10% of students really felt like they would rather do less work and concentrate on the reading. There was no students that felt like there was too much of a mix going on. Proficiency scores, again, we talked about this chart before, so rather than be repetitive, we'll skip down to the chart here. This is specifically on their performance on Linkit tests here. And the data here, I just want to kind of point out why this table came back here. Student performance obviously had grown from marking period 1 to marking period 4 based on student choice being slowly matriculated into the curriculum. And there is a comparable positive correlation evident in student proficiency on standardized assessment. These Linkit assessments here are standardized assessment. You can see that the growth based off of student choice, as well as the performance on the standardized assessment that's not student choice, shows consistent growth across the board. This demonstrates that there is a transference of learning based off of how they're learning with their independent choices and how they're learning with their standardized choices. That the growth is pretty consistent from independent to standardized, and the sharpest growth, obviously, as it says here, is in the special education populations, where you can kind of see a sharper growth here as well as down here. So some of the results and conclusions. The first evaluation that I did, the first evaluation was conducted in isolation without any data. It's just based off of teacher experience and looking at the rubric and assessing the curriculum independently. The curriculum obviously was being evaluated based off of a rubric that was informed by the NJCCSS evaluation rubric, which led to the product that was created, the evaluation tool that was created for this capstone study. The criterion components that were being used include shifts in instruction and learning, curriculum framework and assessment alignment, unit organization and purpose, special needs populations, instructional platforms and resources, text complexity and diversity, research writing and technology, speaking and listening assessments, as well as language development assessments. The evaluation tool featured a Likert scale, like I mentioned before, qualifying the different components, whether they're exceeding, meeting, approaching, partially meeting, or not meeting guidelines. There was a spot for notes and annotations, as well as recommendations that were done in isolation, and then preliminary findings were used to kind of corroborate the initial findings. The results and conclusions, there was a second evaluation that was complete. After the first one was done in isolation, the second one was used, this time was used with support. So there was applied data that I was using from the tools that I outlined earlier that was used to corroborate the first evaluation that was done with the evaluation tool. The applied archive data were basically to corroborate the findings that were done both in qualitative and quantitative data, looking at the student surveys as well as the gradebook and Linkit scores that were being used during the 2021 school year. We applied the aforementioned data analysis techniques, like I mentioned grounded theory before. The grounded theory was basically used to kind of scaffold the data through coding. Descriptive and inferential statistics were used to clarify the categories and correlations that were being used for data collection. Thematic analysis was used to identify criteria and components that were part of the data sets and data tables that were being created. And concurrent triangulation design obviously provided some observations and recommendations based off of a summation of the other data analysis techniques used in tandem. And looking at the specific results of the curriculum evaluation, we're going to go component by component and kind of look at how it was set up. The first component, shifts in instruction and learning, was deemed to be partially meeting proficiency when doing a curriculum evaluation. The evaluation observations for this particular component demonstrated that it includes the best practices that were all aligned to the NJCCSS. However, the instruction was outdated. The instructional technology and resources were, very teacher-centered, very traditional. There's no explicit technology component in this particular unit or component. Accessibility issue and learning resources and assessment platforms. So that kind of created inequality in terms of students' ability to learn. There was no contemporary pedagogical preparation. Like I said, there was a lot of traditional, very outdated methodology that was implemented in this curriculum. The curriculum is very teacher-centered and very text-dependent, so it kind of creates a very narrow perspective for the students with no flexibility or student choice being offered in the way the curriculum was designed. Some recommendations for the curriculum for improvement or adjustments that could be made to align themselves more clearly with the rubric would be number one, modernizing curriculum by providing more literature and informational text that's more contemporary in nature, ensuring that there is an explicit technology component that's being added, looking at different platforms and things like that, digital platforms like Common Lit, Newsela, that provide tandem pieces both with literature and informational text, providing more student choice with texts and assessments, giving them the flexibility to kind of navigate through stuff that's a little bit more student-centered approach as opposed to a teacher-centered approach. And more importantly, making it more standards dependent as opposed to text dependent. This way the students have the flexibility to choose the text they want as long as they're still meeting those same standards. The second component that was evaluated for this research study was curriculum framework and alignment. And in using the evaluation tool, it was determined that the district curriculum is approaching standard. In looking at evaluation observations of the curriculum, there is a strong traditional British literary canon and subsequent literary criticism that goes along with that canon. The formative and summative assessments are strictly aligned, so they do go together. However, there's a lack of contemporary authors and context. So, for example, the most modern book that was in the curriculum was William Golding's novel from 1954, Lord of the Flies. And certainly, 21st century audience is going to have a hard time building, a strong correlation to something that was written about 70 years before their lifetime. The curriculum also featured an inadequate balance of literary and informational text. The state recommends 70% informational, 30% literary, and it was nearly 100% literary in some of the different unit components. So there's an inequality or inadequate balance between the two. So some recommendations that are made for this particular component, obviously, is using more contemporary literature and informational text. As I mentioned on the previous slide, using resources like Newsela and Common Lit will provide more updated platforms as well as updated text. And then certainly adding more diverse perspectives, to improve student engagement and proficiency. Looking at the previous data, students that connect better with their literature have a tendency to perform better. So adding more diverse perspectives invites more students to read unique cultural experiences, give an opportunity to connect to their text a little better. And obviously, like I mentioned before, student choice for formative and summative assessments will go a long way towards strengthening up the curriculum framework and alignment. The next component involved the unit organization and purpose. In this particular case, we're looking at the way each unit was organized from beginning to end. Some evaluation observations for this particular component for this unit study. This curriculum shows that the units of study do have clear goals in mind. There is a articulation that has some clear goals and objectives in mind. The units are aligned properly, meaning that the formative assessments do inform the summative assessments that the students will be taking, and the NJCCSS are clearly stipulated throughout the course of the curriculum. However, as I mentioned before, the curriculum is very text-driven, so it's incumbent on teacher-centered text and teacher-chosen text, and trying to eliminate that teacher dependency would kind of open up perspectives a little bit. Having too much teacher dependency narrows the perspectives of learners. So this is kind of a way to kind of improve that opportunity. Some recommendations, obviously, the curriculum should be more standards driven, not text driven, giving kids an opportunity to kind of, show the standards in unique ways using unique text of their own choosing. Student-centeredness leads to more open perspectives. I mentioned that before. And student choice, letting them choose between their books and assessments obviously will increase their engagement and performance as well. The data supports that student engagement and performance increases when students have a hand in designing their own alignment and curriculum choices. Certainly the end of year survey that I shared with you before, as well as their performance in the fourth marking period kind of corroborates that. The curriculum evaluation also concluded that the district curriculum is also meeting the standards for the special needs populations in the school. The curriculum units are scaffolded properly and allows for modifications and amendments that are noted for IEPs and students have protections under 504. It also includes enrichment and enhancement for advanced proficient learners as well. So it's not just about the special needs population, but the advanced proficient population as well. However, the advanced proficient population, even though there's more opportunity for enrichment and enhancement, comes with more assignments and faster pacing, which doesn't necessarily demonstrate stronger rigor. So with recommendations for this particular section, certainly adding more contemporary choices, which was mentioned in some of the other components, but also adding diverse digital platforms and modifications for enrichment. Using a platform like Newsela, for example, allows students to work from documents that have a higher lexile level or more challenging lexicon in order to kind of give them a little bit more comprehensive rigor when they're reading. For the enrichment and enhancement students, again, not necessarily giving them more assignments, but having less assignments, that are on par with their um, regularly proficient student counterparts, but having more rigor associated with their work, not necessarily having more assignments, but more rigorous assignments. I think is going to make the difference between scaffolding things properly for the advanced proficient student, and then obviously slowing the pacing down a little bit. They don't necessarily have to work faster, but just give them more robust text and assessment choices to work from. Should be adequate recommendations for special populations. In doing curriculum evaluation for instructional resources, this was one of the weaker points of the curriculum, so it's only partially meeting. In observations that are made in looking at the curriculum and looking at the data that goes along with the curriculum, number one, the summative assessments are properly aligned and rigorous, and there is an explicit use of text-dependent assessment. The instructional resources provided inadequate support, however. So a lot of the alignment that was in place kind of lacks support and resources to support kids with special needs. There's no interactive or digital platforms or resources that are being used, which kind of limits accessibility to learning. Again, the teacher-centered design creates a more narrow perspective for learning. Especially when it comes to instructional resources, kind of having that narrow lens kind of limits what students can really learn in terms of perspective. And then inadequate shifts in instruction and learning. Certainly the old school methodology that we talked about before, the traditional forms of instruction and learning are a little bit outdated. So recommendations for instructional resources, like a lot of other parts of the curriculum, involve modernizing the curriculum, providing more reading choices that are contemporary in nature, both literature and informational text, providing more resources for support and enrichment, especially using them on digital platforms to increase accessibility, having more unique forms of assessment, both formative and summative, allowing students to have some choices on that. And then certainly offering work that has more perspective, multiple perspectives and cultural influences rather than having everything be traditionally from similar lenses. Student choice and student-centeredness learning, obviously we've mentioned several times before, is an important part for this component, and then including an explicit technology component would certainly strengthen up the instructional resources made available to the students. Text complexity was another part of the curriculum evaluation that designated the district as meeting these objectives. Certainly in doing an evaluation or making observations about the curriculum that's in place, there is a robust text set of traditional literary canon, mentioned that several times before. There's a comprehensive list of seminal documents and literary criticisms to go along with that literary canon that all operate at a very high lexile level. However, all the all the reading selections are all teacher selected, which is kind of limits that perspective we talked about before. So some recommendations for improving the text complexity section of the curriculum. Certainly outdated selections should be updated to fit more contemporary context. This way the students can make better connections to what they're reading. Then it means including diversity to kind of pique student interest and increase engagement. And then lastly, those digital platforms that we talked about before, like Common Lit and Newsela, will promote more student choice. And that should hopefully give kids a new opportunity to kind of look at texts that are complex in a more student-centered classroom. Perhaps one of the weakest points in the curriculum evaluation had to do with diversity that's being outlined in the curriculum. The curriculum simply does not feature very much diversity at all. Predominantly, the curriculum in question is considered classic literature using British literary canon. Most of the books offer a singular perspective, meaning they're written by men. They have Eurocentric ideology tied to them. They're written by, white men that were in a position of dominance. So it kind of offered a very narrow perspective in terms of being able to look at things from unique perspectives and cultural influences. Lack of women, lack of people of color, for example, kind of, you know, puts a lot of dependency on that Eurocentric white point of view without giving much credence to some of those other options. So certainly recommendations for the curriculum, diversifying text and text choices, infusing explicit digital learning platforms to offer unique perspectives. Like I said, including works by people of color, women, multicultural, as well as people that are in positions of inferiority, create unique perspectives in reading, which will encourage students to, um, have less teacher dependency and be able to explore things more independently. Looking at technology instruction, again, this is something that the school district is only partially meeting and doing an evaluation of technology instruction. Some observations that were made. Number one, that technology is not specifically stipulated in the curriculum with literary or informational text. It's kind of sporadic in the curriculum, if you will. The only observed part of the curriculum that involved any direct correlation with technology instruction was a research paper, which was only one unit of study that was about 4 weeks long. And the emphasis was on Microsoft Word, internet-based research, and using a authenticity check resource like Turnitin.com. The students worked from a lot of hard copies or digital copies that were modified as hard copies only, so kind of narrowed their perspective on resources that were being made available to them. Certainly, lots of recommendations for this section here. Obviously, stipulate specific technology instruction using multiple platforms. Google Apps for Education, obviously, being an important part of that. Using resources like No Red Ink, which is a website that features not only lessons about grammar, but lessons about writing and different types of writing. Using a resource like Noodle Tools. Noodle Tools is an assessment that allows students to keep track of their sources and resources for research paper writing, as well as a way to make sure that they could provide a bibliography or a works cited of the works that they use for their paper. Infusing the use of technology with literary and informational text. We mentioned Common Lit Newsela on some of the previous components. Subscribing to multiple online databases like EBSCO, Facts on File, Search Issues Researcher. These are all curated databases that provide more factual and scholarly resources so students get a better sense of scholarly research when they're putting their own papers together and proving their own points with evidence. Expanding on the authenticity to maintaining resource. I talked about Noodle Tools before, as opposed to just using Turnitin to check the authenticity of test at the end, or the authenticity of the paper at the end. Have students be able to monitor their own progress using a tool like Noodle Tools. And obviously providing more opportunities to practice research and problem solving instead of just having one research topic or one research paper during the course of the year. Maybe having several small research topics that allow students to kind of explore problem solving and opportunity to kind of practice research techniques using those databases and other online platforms. Writing instruction, when evaluating the curriculum in this case, again, the curriculum was only partially meeting the proficiency standard. An evaluation and observation for writing instruction. Certainly writing assignments and prompts are embedded in each unit of study, but there was no specific instructional component to go along with those writing assignments. There's topics and prompts that were provided by the teacher, but everything was pretty much teacher-centered and teacher-driven, and teachers were required to provide feedback and lesson as needed. The writing process was defined in the research writing paper, the research writing section only, and not really stipulated for other types of writing like narrative writing or expository writing. Recommendations for this part obviously include providing specific writing instructions and stipulating the differences between different types of writing, like persuasive and argumentative writing versus expository and informational writing versus narrative writing and poetry. What makes each one of those writing styles unique, and having some direct instruction on those types of writing strategies. And also using an online learning platform like No Red Ink can provide approaches to grammar and usage as well as writing. The website provides a lot of templates and things like that to help students kind of frame their writing as well. Speaking and listening skills, again, as I mentioned before, are kind of standards that are somewhat neglected in the curriculum implementation here. So in doing a curriculum evaluation of assessments linked to speaking and listening standards, it's evident that there is no explicit reference to speaking or listening standards as part of instruction. There are some assessments and assignments aligned to speaking and listening that are evident in the curriculum that have some rubrics with them, but no direct instruction is evident. So, in order to improve or make recommendations to improve the alignment in this particular case, obviously providing more opportunities for discourse, both with class discussions, either online or in person, depending on the nature of the learning environment, but also book talks, debates, Socratic seminars, and speeches as well, are all speaking and listening standards that allow students to kind of work on those things. Providing virtual or digital platform for online discussions. Obviously, virtual learning last year taught us a lot about Zoom and Google Meets and things like that as a way to kind of communicate a little bit. Providing lessons on digital media literacy using established examples outlined above, or maybe embedding audiobooks as part of a reading option and not just as a modification for students with special needs or ELL, but having the audiobooks available to all learners. Lastly, language development is something else that in the curriculum evaluation was only determined as partially meeting proficiency. An evaluation and observation for the curriculum in this case, there's an emphasis on context-specific vocabulary, using context from different literary texts like Frankenstein or Macbeth, for example. But there is no emphasis on non-content specific vocabulary acquisition, which implies, words in a real-world setting. There's also no explicit instruction for the rules of grammar, like spelling or punctuation, capitalization, etc. There's no instruction for linguistics, syntax, or semantics, or even word origins or etymology. So, there's no language resource, text, or digital platform for the students to learn from. So it kind of inhibits their introduction to language and language development. So obviously some recommendations, obviously, to improve language acquisition outside of the context, providing some real world vocabulary, using a website like Membeing can certainly help with that. And infusing a digital learning platform for lessons and practice like NoReading provides lessons, practice, diagnostic quizzes, things like that for both grammar and writing instruction. The strengths of using this type of methodology, obviously, familiarity. Having worked with this curriculum for 15 years, you develop an understanding and an inclination for the strengths and weaknesses of the curriculum. Certainly, my relationship with the students, the data collection pool from the 2021 school year had an effect on the type of methodology that was used for this research study. I indicated earlier some supposition about curriculum flaws based on experience. I had an idea about things that I wanted to fix when given the opportunity to do so. During the 2021 school year, a lot of the programs and things that are being recommended as part of this curriculum revision evaluation kind of came from programs that were piloted during the 2021 school year. And then certainly the anticipation of completing a study on curriculum evaluation during the course of my study of Western governors kind of lent to some of the data collection instruments that are being created and designed by me. So I would have a better idea about how to qualify some of the changes that were being made to the curriculum in real time. The evaluation tool was derived from the state rubric to ensure alignment. So a lot of the components that are used in the evaluation tool that I created, the product I created, is in line with what the state is looking for. Other strengths include the flexibility that was granted by the district administration to pilot new programs during the 2021 school year. Certainly without that flexibility and opportunity, I wouldn't have had as many recommendations to make for the curriculum evaluation as I do. Flexibility with budget was another strength of the methodology that was being used. Certainly, the state and federal support that came from the COVID-19 pandemic certainly lent itself to being able to have unique platforms and resources to use for this curriculum evaluation and study. Application of mixed methods and multiple data analysis techniques to corroborate the findings is also a strength in the methodology because it, basically gave me a lot of opportunity to kind of cross-reference a lot of the the qualitative and quantitative data that was gathered during the course of the study using the instruments that were provided. And then certainly, lastly, another strength is that the recommendations are made with confidence due to successful piloting during the 2021 school year that I mentioned before. Some weaknesses of using this methodology, obviously, applied research is very limited in scope, which may have flawed or skewed results. Certainly the COVID-19 pandemic was very recent, so it has a tendency to kind of create somewhat limitation in terms of corroborating the study. Certainly, the teacher or the researcher's relationship with the students and the instruments kind of creates some impartial data. Since I kind of had an idea about what I wanted to do, some of the assessment instruments that were created were done in that vein, as well as having a relationship with the students certainly kind of may have an impartial impact on some of the data collection. Students not only experienced only experience them, students only experience the modified curriculum and not the curriculum in its district approved form. Certainly the COVID-19 pandemic and being forced into virtual learning, being forced into hybrid cohorts and things like that, forced a modification of the unit so the students really didn't get a chance to engage in the curriculum the way they normally would have. So we're kind of forced to make some of the changes on the fly because of the learning environment modifications. Students did have experience with the curriculum as been written, the way it was written in the first marking period, but things were kind of modified throughout the course of the year as a result of the vacillating nature of the learning environment. There's also a lack of uniformity in the learning environment. As I mentioned before, some students were in person at the end of the year, some were not. Some students learned synchronously, some learned asynchronously. Some students were hybrid or part of a cohort where they were partially in school, partially virtual. So there was a lot of different learning environments going on simultaneously, which created an inconsistent approach to learning and teaching. There was also no control group. Teacher, could not create a control group in the learning environment because all the students were forced to learn in certain ways. So it kind of created difficulty in, setting up an environment where you would have a fair experiment kind of going on. Also, there's no outside party or teacher that has data that can corroborate the researcher's findings. Like I said, all the data and everything that was applied to the study was based off of data that was used during last year's instruction, 2021 school year, using instruments that I created with my students. So it was a very narrow perspective. And also, there's so many variables to account for COVID-19 impact. Certainly, the uniqueness of the school year. I talked about the vacillating nature of the learning environment for different students throughout the course of the year. And then, obviously, other personal experiences students may have had due to their proximity with COVID-19 and other factors that kind of affected their learning. Influential factors, certainly familiarity with the curriculum kind of played into that a little bit. I was already aware of the weaknesses in the curriculum based off my experience with it, so I kind of knew um, what I wanted to do when I was given a flexible interpretation of the 2021 school year. It gave me an opportunity to kind of pilot new programs and digital platforms with the funding that we received from the state. Certainly, a lot of it with some success. Certainly, having familiarity with the students is an influential factor who supplied the archive data. Certainly, they experienced the curriculum and the modifications and everything firsthand. As a researcher, I also had the flexibility to manipulate the content and accessibility, making things digital and kind of modifying things as we went along, kind of created impartiality in terms of how the students were learning and the access to resources that they had. Another influential factor, allotment for more liberal interpretations from students selected text may have skewed proficiency scores. A lot of times the students were picking books that I'd never read before that I wasn't entirely familiar with. So, when I was grading and looking and, generating the data, the quantitative data for their performance on assessments that were linked to literary text or informational text, a lot of it was based on the supposition that the students were fulfilling the standards, not necessarily demonstrating adequate competency in terms of comprehension. So, somewhat a liberal interpretation of the proficiency scores in some ways may have caused skewed results. The researcher conducted a previous research study with the same student population earlier in the school year. I did a different study for Western governors during my first degree program back in September of 2020, or September of 2019, excuse me. And as a result of that, it kind of helped inform some of the curriculum evaluation that was being done for the second study that began throughout the rest of the school year. So obviously, even though I used the same student population, this time it was an applied study as opposed to an action study that was taking place. There were different data instruments and data points that were being used. And certainly the data collection instruments were very curriculum specific. So certainly that all played into the influential factors to the success of the study. Certainly having accessibility to the district archive data, being that, the data from the gradebook was my gradebook, the instruments that were being used were created in the Google Forms account for my account within the school. So getting simply permission from the superintendent was enough to be able to have access to that data. And then certainly, like I mentioned several times, the data points and instruments that were being used were created by myself. So I had a familiarity with them when I was implementing them to the students. In terms of further investigation, looking at flipped classrooms, for example, student-centered learning versus teacher-centered learning would be something worth investigating a little bit more based off of what I learned in the study. Certainly employing student choice, both with literary and informational text. as well as having a blend of teacher and student choices. This seemed to be an overwhelming percentage that I outlined before in terms of students that were interested in being able to make some choices about the curriculum and curriculum plan they had in place. Having multiple choices for a standardized, aligned assessment rather than giving all the students the same type of assessment to work on, giving them some flexibility to choose the assessments that they're most interested in to demonstrate proficiency on literary and informational texts. And then certainly curriculum design, allowing students to kind of choose and design their own curriculum will go a long way in terms of demonstrating proficiency, which was outlined both quantitative and qualitative data that was corroborated earlier in the study. Technology-infused instruction and learning platforms is something else worth investigating. Obviously, digital reading and assessment platforms like Newsela and Common Lit are important to kind of diversify perspective, but also provide more contemporary forms of literature and informational text. Using technology-infused instruction for writing and research, certainly tools like No Red Ink, Noodle tools I talked about before, important resources for that. Linguistics and grammar, I mentioned No Red Ink for that as well. Vocabulary acquisition using Membean. And then certainly unique perspectives and cultural influences by diversifying the text made available to the students or other things that are important for technology-infused instruction and using some learning platforms to kind of make that happen. Lastly, further investigation would involve looking at emerging contemporary writing and authors, just to kind of give students more relevancy to 21st century contexts, being able to make those text and text itself and text to world connections that would make their learning so much more valuable. And obviously, the data that I have in the study kind of supports that as well. All right, so lastly is the references here that were used for the study. I thank Western Governors for the opportunity to present my capstone, and have a good evening. Thanks very much.